Welcome back. Lots of us want to get our heads around complex topics quickly, really understand what's going on.
Absolutely. Cut through the noise.
Exactly. And that's what we do here. Today, we're taking a deep dive into the American front. We've gathered quite a bit of source material on them.
Right. And based on that material, we're looking at a white supremacist group started way back in 1984 with a very specific ideology.
That's the one. Our sources take us from its very beginnings, its early activities, right through to some later incidents involving members.
Quite a timeline.
It is. So our mission today is to pull out the really crucial information, its history, its beliefs, what it actually did, give you a solid overview, but keep it concise.
Sounds good. Where do you start? San Francisco, 84.
Let's do it. So the American Front, founded by Bob Hike, San Francisco, 1984. What's key, as you said, is it wasn't super organized at first, was it?
No, not at all. The sources point to a pretty loose structure, apparently modeled on the British National Front, interestingly enough.
Okay. And what was the initial, driving force? The punk scene comes up in the material.
Yeah, it seems the initial focus was nationalist, anti-communist, kind of a reaction against the leftist elements Hike saw in the San Francisco punk subculture at the time.
So a reaction. And the
Yeah.
idea was to be an umbrella group for skinheads.
That was an aim.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it seems that lack of formal structure kind of hampered that. It didn't quite become the central skinhead organization they might have envisioned.
And Hike ran into trouble pretty quickly, even with other skinheads.
It looks like it. The sources mention him losing favor. Things like unwanted media attention, acts of vandalism, targeting the Bound Together bookstore, harassing interracial couples, that sort of thing.
Right, stuff that draws heat.
Exactly. And politically, he started shifting more towards Nazism, which, according to the sources, alienated a lot of the skinheads back then who maybe weren't primarily political.
They were more about the music, the attitude.
Perhaps, yeah. And there were even accusations flying around that Hike was just trying to, take over the local scene for his own political goals.
So if he was losing some skinheads, who else was getting involved? The material mentions heavy metal fans, rural white workers.
That's right. There was this effort to branch out.
Yeah.
And also a group called the United White Brethren, though that seems to have been pretty short-lived.
Okay. But then things shifted around 1987.
Seems so. The sources suggest a new generation of skinheads came along who were actually more open to Nazi ideology.
Okay.
And that's apparently when the American Front, or AF, started to become more of a distinct political organization, attracting members who were more ideologically aligned, even if the numbers weren't huge.
Right. So late 80s, they're getting a bit more defined, and they set up a telephone hotline. That feels very of its time.
It does, doesn't it? And the message was, well, pretty chilling. Callers would hear this question at the end. Do you have hate in your heart?
Wow.
And they used that Jack London quote quite a bit. I'm a worker, but first of all, I'm a white worker.
Okay, that really spells out the ideology, doesn't it? Racial identity above all else.
Precisely. And this period also saw their first sort of public events, like that White Workers' Day March in San Francisco in '88.
Yeah, the sources mentioned about 65 people showed up, and kind of strangely, some white hippies were there.
That detail is fascinating, isn't it? The sources don't really explain why, but it definitely highlights the maybe somewhat chaotic or contradictory nature of the group back then.
It does, but they were starting to get noticed by bigger players in the movement. Tom Metzger.
Yes, Tom Metzger of White Aryan Resistance, or WAR, he really started promoting Hike, used his own platforms, hotline, newspaper, TV, to position Hike as a spokesman for white power skinheads.
So Hike was getting media exposure, Rolling Stone, Hustler, even Sassy Magazine.
Yeah, the Reporters TV show, too. That's quite a mix. And by 1989, the AF was claiming chapters in, 14 states?
That sounds like significant growth, on paper at least.
On paper, yeah. Which kind of leads logically into their next big, ambitious plan. Or maybe infamous plan.
The Aryan Woodstock.
That's the one. 1989, near Napa, California. Hike's idea for a big white power concert.
But it didn't go smoothly. Metzger got involved again.
He did. Metzger basically muscled in, took over, even renamed it Aryan Woodstock. Hike wasn't happy.
I can imagine. What was the conflict about?
Promotion, mainly. Metzger wanted to advertise it widely, including on his hotline, which was known to be monitored by anti-racist groups. Hike was worried that would give opponents too much warning.
Makes sense. And they didn't bother with permits initially?
Well, they were apparently told they didn't need one for a private event with music as long as sanitation was handled.
Famous last words, perhaps.
You think? So local news picked it up.
Oh, yeah, big time. Napa County officials then tried to get a legal injunction to stop it. Hike actually went to court to fight for it.
And the result?
The judge said, okay, you can gather, but no music.
No music at Woodstock. The irony.
Right. So the day arrives, maybe 300 people turn up. But the landowner eventually let the authorities block the entrance, so a lot of people couldn't even get in. And protesters showed up too.
Several hundred yet demonstrating outside. The whole thing just cranked up the tension between the American Front and Metzger's war group.
Yeah, sounds like a fiasco that probably didn't help their image or unity.
Not at all. Seemed to expose some internal divisions and, frankly, maybe some organizational weaknesses.
So moving into 1990, they planned another public event, this time back in San Francisco, Union Square.
They did. But the sources paint a picture of well, a stark mismatch in numbers.
How so?
Hike shows up with just a handful of supporters, maybe a dozen or so, and they're met by something like 300 counter-protesters.
Wow.
Things apparently got heated, debris thrown, the police had to step in and separate everyone. But yeah, the AF and the police were heavily outnumbered. Really shows their limited appeal in a city like San Francisco.
Also in 1990, there was that incident where an anti-racist group, the Coalition for Human Dignity, published Hike's home address. He'd moved to Portland by then.
That's right. They published his Portland address, which led to local news coverage right as he was settling in. Shows the kind of direct action tactics used by opponents.
Intense scrutiny. But he was still getting TV appearances, though maybe a different kind.
Yeah, the sources mention a shift towards what they call trash TV, like Geraldo Rivera's show. Maybe the more mainstream media interest was fading.
So the focus shifts more local in the early 90s. Demonstrations in Portland.
Seems that way. More local activism. And then you have the Ruby Ridge incident in '92, which is pretty significant.
Right. What was the AF's involvement there?
Hike and some associates were actually among the first out-of-state extremists to arrive at the standoff site supporting Randy Weaver.
Really? Did they do anything specific?
Hike apparently blockaded a fuel truck that was trying to make a delivery and publicly berated the driver for, supporting the government. Really highlights that anti-government stance they had.
Okay. And during this period, the early 90s, it was more about distributing literature demonstrations.
Yeah, that kind of traditional activism. They revived the telephone hotline, this time in Portland.
And there was a magazine, The Voice of Revolution.
Right. Published by the Washington and California AF sections. And the sources link it to Combat 18 over in England.
Combat 18, another neo-Nazi group, right? Shows international links.
Exactly. Suggests some networking was going on. And predictably, perhaps, they were also actively campaigning against hate crime laws.
A common position for these kinds of groups.
Very common.
Then, 1995, a big change. Bob Hike leaves the group he founded.
Yeah, steps down as leader. That must have created a bit of a vacuum, you'd think.
Definitely suggests a period of uncertainty. The sources then jump forward a bit, mentioning a kind of resurgence in the 2000s.
A bit, yeah. Under a new guy, James Parasso. He moved the group's base to Harrison, Arkansas.
Arkansas, okay.
Yeah.
And promoted a different ideology, third positionism.
That's the term used, third positionism.
Yeah.
It's a complex far-right ideology. Tries to blend elements of fascism with anti-capitalism.
So positioning itself against both capitalism and communism.
Right. Kind of a radical third way, but critically, still rooted in white supremacy and racial exclusion. That's the core element detailed in our sources.
Okay. Then we get into the 2010s, and things seem to get, well, more violent and concerning. The leader, David Lynch, was killed in 2011.
Yeah, shot dead in Sacramento, California. A pretty stark event. The sources don't specify the motive, but his death definitely points to instability, maybe internal conflict within what was likely an already fractured group by then.
A reminder of the potential for violence surrounding these groups.
For sure. It underscored the volatile environment these organizations can operate in or create.
And then just a year later, 2012, those arrests down in Florida, near Disney World, of all places.
Yeah, St. Cloud, Florida. Members arrested for paramilitary training, among other charges. That paints a disturbing picture.
Paramilitary training. What were they supposedly training for? Did the sources get into their goals?
Well, 10 members were arrested on charges, including the training, also shooting into an occupied dwelling. It sounds very serious. Suggests a definite step beyond just talk towards preparing for actual violence.
And that led to the arrest of Marcus Fiala and others, trying to incite a race war.
Exactly. That was the charge. He was convicted, though the sentence wasn't particularly long.
And the judge called them the gang that couldn't shoot straight. That's quite a quote, given the charge.
It is. A bit jarring. maybe highlighting perceived incompetence, but the intent to incite racial violence is obviously incredibly serious.
And Fiala later got Augustus Saul Invictus, another far-right figure, as his lawyer for the appeal.
Right. Which again just highlights the interconnectedness, the ideological threads running through that broader movement.
So looking back at this whole history we've just walked through, it's quite a journey. From that loose anti-communist start to full-blown white supremacy, attempts at national reach.
Which never fully seemed to materialize.
Right, followed by public actions, lots of internal conflict, it seems, and then fragmentation, and these later, quite frankly, scary incidents.
Yeah, the whole trajectory is really telling, isn't it? From counterculture reaction, adopting neo-Nazism, the public gathering attempts like Aryan Woodstock, the shift to local stuff, and then these later, more disturbing paramilitary aspects and plots. It's quite a case study.
It really is. It shows how these extremist movements can evolve and also the challenges they face, the ways they can splinter.
Definitely underscores why it's important to understand the history and activities of groups like this, even as they change form over the years.
Absolutely. So maybe something for everyone listening to think about. Considering all these phases we've discussed, from Hike's initial group to the later Florida incidents, what does the story of the American Front tell us about how extremist movements change, how they fracture,
Yeah.
what really drove their moments of, well, apparent growth, and what led to their decline and fragmentation? Definitely food for thought.